3 Republican sources with direct knowledge of Hegseth's nomination process tell NBC News that as many as 6 Senate Republicans, and perhaps more, are currently not comfortable supporting his bid. This comes as another NBC News report sourcing 10 current and former Fox employees who say Hegseth drank in ways that concerned his coworkers. The extensive reporting includes accounts from Hegseth's time as a co-host of Fox and Friends Weekend. 2 of those people said that on more than a dozen occasions, they smelled alcohol on Hegseth before he went on air. One of the former Fox employees said, quote, "For the sake of national security, I really hope he has stopped drinking." Another added he should not be Secretary of Defense. His drinking should be disqualifying. It's just the latest in a series of serious allegations against Hegseth. Tonight, the Trump transition team responded to the NBC News reporting, calling the claims completely unfounded and false. Just in the last week, we've heard from Hegseth's own mother, who in a letter obtained by the New York Times called her son, quote, "an abuser of women, a man that belittles, lies, cheats, sleeps around, and uses women for his own power and ego." His mother later told the Times she apologized and had fired off that email in anger with emotion at a time when he and his wife were going through a very difficult divorce. We've also read in Jane Mayer's reporting in The New Yorker that he was forced to step down by 2 nonprofit advocacy groups in the face of financial mismanagement, sexual impropriety, and personal misconduct allegations. His lawyer told The New Yorker that these allegations were, quote, "outlandish claims laundered through The New Yorker by a petty and jealous, disgruntled former associate," unquote. Joining me now is Courtney Kube, NBC News national security correspondent, and Nancy Parrish, founder and CEO of Protect Our Defenders, an organization dedicated to ending sexual violence in the military. Courtney, I want to ask you to do 2 things. Tell me first about what was going on at Fox and what was the extent of the concern of these coworkers who spoke to NBC News about him, and what is the state of his nomination among Republicans, Senate Republicans?
So this was 10 current and former Fox News employees, some of whom worked directly with him on the show Fox and Friends, the popular Saturday morning or weekend show that he's been a host of. And these people all gave us a very similar picture of what they saw during their years working there over the course of various times, from the time that Pete Hegseth first started working at Fox News. And they described cases where the show would start at 6 a.m. He would show up in some cases only minutes before the show was about to start. The staff, the producers would be concerned, was he going to show up at all? And at times he would come in and he would be talking about how he was still hungover from, or even in some cases, still smelling of alcohol from the night before. Some cases he would show up so late that they would actually even rush him onto the set, put his makeup on. They'd be talking through some of the topics as they were literally moving him onto the set to get on the air. And it caused a lot of stress and pressure for the staff of that show and for other colleagues at Fox News. Now, we know that this was occurring until at least 2020, maybe 2021, but we even have a former Fox colleague, Fox News employee, who said that there were concerns about this as recently as last month. Of course, he terminated his contract with Fox News on November 12th when President-elect Donald Trump announced that he was going to be his selection to be the Secretary of Defense. But Joy, you work on a show. When you have an anchor or a host who is engaged in this kind of behavior, showing up, not always reliable, it really puts a lot of pressure on the show. I should say, none of the people were aware of a time where he missed an appearance or he was actually drunk on the air. But they said that that there were multiple occasions where he would show up and he clearly was still showing signs of his partying from the night before, Joy.
Right. And so Senate Republicans are now thinking twice about this, at least some?
Yeah. So, there are a number of Republican senators who would normally support President-elect Donald Trump's selections here. But it's not just the policies. Remember, when Hegseth's name first came out, there was a lot of talk for the first few days about some policy decisions that he might try to enact. if he was confirmed to be Secretary of Defense. The biggest one that we talked about was the idea of no longer allowing women to serve in combat positions. But we've really changed because since that time, there have just been a series of stories and allegations about character flaws. Now, the drinking that we're talking about here tonight, you mentioned the New Yorker reporting, that also highlighted some concerns about his ability, frankly, just to be able to manage an organization. It called into question when he was one of the leaders of Concerned Veterans of America, a nonprofit, that he apparently mismanaged the money. He blew through money, and it's not really clear where it all went. And then, of course, there are the allegations that we've heard about his treatment of women, allegation of sexual assault. So all of these character concerns, in addition to the fact that he frankly does not have the level of experience that most Secretary of Defense nominees have, never having run a government institution, never really having been in charge of anyone more than the size of basically a platoon. The combination of those things is why some Republican senators are really starting to be more public, expressing their concerns about his nomination. And I will say, we've been told that there are 6 and maybe even more Republican senators who are really leaning against voting for his nomination at this point, Joy.
Right. I mean, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, has tremendous responsibilities that are 24/7. And so one could understand why they would have some concern, serious concern. Nancy Parrish, I want to bring you in here because the concerns about the rape allegation, which I often must say he did deny, are still there. And his side is trying to claim that those were thrown out simply because there were not charges. But that doesn't mean that the allegations aren't true. He did pay this claimant and make her sign an NDA. But the other thing that the Defense Department has to deal with, in August 2024, there was a Brown University study showing the number of sexual assaults in the United States military is likely 2 to 4 times higher than government estimates. The Brown University study estimated there were 75,500 plus cases of sexual assault in 2021. We're in an advocacy group for women who've been through sexual assault in the military. What would it mean to the people that you have worked with and convened with if the head of the Department of Defense is somebody with these kind of accusations?
Joy, we provide pro bono legal services to survivors, active duty members, their families, veterans, and we advocate for policies to eliminate sexual assault and dismantling demeaning, harmful attitudes towards women. I have seen firsthand how these reforms, these bipartisan reforms by leaders like Senator Joni Ernst and Senator Gillibrand have restored trust for survivors and encourage more women to consider military service. Women are critical to meeting military recruitment needs. The military admits there are not enough young men to fill our ranks. Pete Hegseth's troubling attitudes and past, his opposition to women in combat, disqualifies him. Survivors, their families, and advocates are watching. Their leadership decision, this leadership decision, will define our military future. I cannot think of a worse pick for Secretary of Defense, for women who may think of serving, for survivors of sexual assault in the military. I can't imagine what our soon-to-be commander-in-chief was thinking. It's outrageous.